Happy Monday, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join us today to talk about single stairway buildings and their connection to the risks that first responders face, the purpose of current codes and standards, and how to balance the need for housing affordability with continued safety for both residents and first responders. My name is John Drummond. I'm the Director of Government Affairs with the Congressional Fire Services Institute, and I'm pleased to be joined today by colleagues from the Fire Service and codes and standards specialists. First, we have Sean DeCrane. He's the Director of Firefighter Health and Safety Operational Services for the International Association of Firefighters. Chief Robert Marshall is a Senior Regulatory Engineer in the Codes and Regulatory Services at UL Solutions and a retired Deputy Fire Chief for the San Mateo Consolidated Fire Department. He currently serves as the Vice Chair of the International Association of Fire Chiefs Fire and Life Safety Section. We also have Bob Sullivan. He is a Senior Regional Representative with the National Fire Protection Association. And we have Karl Fippinger, who is the Vice President of Fire and Disaster Mitigation for the International Code Council. Thank you all for being here. So I'd like to take this webinar, I think, in 4 parts. First, we'll get some background on codes and standards and their relation to single-stair buildings. Then we'll cover the current policy landscape of the issue. Then we will move to a discussion about the reality on the ground for the fire service in these situations. And finally, we'll end with some advice from our panelists on next steps. So we'll call it Codes and Standards 101. For our ICC and NFPA panelists, can you talk about how your groups develop the code process, how the code development process works, and how do you ensure safety, transparency, and inclusion of all stakeholders? Either Karl or Bob, if you want to start.
Sure, John. Glad to. So, hi everyone, Karl Fippinger, Vice President, Fire and Disaster Mitigation at the International Code Council. So the ICC, or International Code Council, model codes are developed every 3 years. We follow a democratic approach to developing and publishing the codes, and that enables people closest to the codes to shape the regulations and participate in ensuring the public health, safety, and welfare of their communities. The ICC governmental consensus process is open to all parties, and we've established safeguards to avoid domination by proprietary interests. The final vote on all model codes rests with regulators. That's to say that regulators are those who administer, formulate, or enforce regulations relating to public health, safety, and welfare. So as I said, the codes are developed every 3 years, and our code development process principles follow really 4 major pillars. And those pillars are openness, balance of interest, transparency, and last but not least, an appeals process. So in terms of openness, participation in the development of the codes, including all of our code hearings, they're open to all comers at no cost. Anyone can submit a code change proposal or make a public comment. The only caveat to that is myself and the other 700 staff members at the ICC, we are conflicted out of being able to participate in the code development process, so we are the facilitators of that process. And all of our code committees have to consider all views from the floor before voting. In terms of balance of interest, committee members represent general interests, user interest, producer interest, or multiple interests, and I'll cover what those specific categories are later. But the takeaway here is that 1/3 of each committee that we establish to hear the model codes and their proposals, as well as any code development committees that develop codes for the ICC, have to be public safety officials in the regulator area. Committee members can't vote on issues that are a conflict of interest to them. They must recuse themselves. And then ICC membership is not a commission of committee membership. Again, it's open to all parties. In terms of transparency, evidence of the committee vote with reason must be documented for each committee and each code change proposal that's presented. Final decisions are made in an open hearing by public safety officials, and no one may have any financial gain or interest in the outcome of those proposals. Last but not least, as I said, there's an appeals process. Anyone can appeal an action or inaction of a code committee. ICC renders its decision on the appeal based on whether or not due process was served in the process. So to dig in just a little bit deeper on our code development process, here are the representation of interest. When we talk about those three major categories. Again, general, producer, or user. General is typically your consumers and your regulators. So we say that at least 1/3 of every committee needs to be composed of public safety regulators. That's the general interest area. Another third is producers. Those are your builders, contractors, manufacturers, material associations, other standards development organization or SDOs, or testing labs. And then users are academia, designers, research labs owners, product certifiers. Again, the big takeaway here, not less than 1/3 of each committee are composed of regulators. So with the I-codes being published every 3 years, that means a typical 3-year cycle looks like we break our codes down. There are 15 model codes, so we break those down across two major groups, Group A and Group B, for our hearing. So Group A was held for the 2027 cycle, which we're just wrapping up. We started to hear the Group A presentations in 2024, received about 1,000 code change proposals submitted for that process. Group B, similarly in 2025, received approximately 1,000 code change proposals. And now in 2026, we're entering the public comment hearing phase for both Group A and Group B. So all public comments across all 15 of the model codes will be heard here next month in Hartford, Connecticut, the year 2026. The online governmental consensus vote, which is where the regulators maintain the final voting for each of the code changes, that will take place online. For those who are not present at the public comment hearings, that will take place across 2 weeks immediately following those hearings in late April and early May. So that's our process in a nutshell. I know that's a lot, but hopefully that answers the question and also tees it up for my colleague Bob to be able to give a good summary of what takes place at the NFPA.
Hey, thanks, Karl. Hi, everybody. My name is Bob Sullivan, Senior Regional Director with the National Fire Protection Association, otherwise known as NFPA. And we have a standards development process for all NFPA standards. We have over 300 standards, many of which have been around for quite some time, some of them over 100 years. You'll hear some similarities in our process to the ICC process that Karl just described in terms of the consensus-based process that is used to develop our codes and standards. In short, it is a public, open process that anybody can partake in except for the people who actually work at NFPA. Similar to ICC, the people who work at NFPA are not allowed to be part of the process in terms of putting in public comments, public inputs, or final votes. We help to facilitate the process, and then we bring in experts from the outside to take care of the process. So we also have several categories of experts who make up our technical committees, or the committees that actually write our codes and standards. And again, they're made up of people who are not employees of NFPA, and we bring them from all walks of life, all areas of expertise to come together on the technical committees and form the committee that actually writes the codes and standards. And the whole process is open to the public. So at several points through the process, the public can submit comments online through our formal process. It's open to anybody. It can be done easily from any electronic device that you have, for example, at home or work. So it's not even anything that you have to go somewhere special or anything like that. Summarizing the way our process works, if we receive a request to develop a new code or standard or to modify an existing standard, that starts the process where similarly, our codes and standards are written and or redeveloped every 3 to 5 years, depending on exactly which code or standard that you're talking about. Public inputs come in. That forms the basis of what is the technical committee going to talk about for the next edition of the code or standard. That process is open for several months. Anybody can submit comments. The technical committee will then meet sometime later that year, discuss all the public inputs and comments that were received, vote on them, decide how things are going to be worded and put into the codes and standards in different places. And then we publish a draft copy of that code and standard. That draft copy is then itself open for several months for public comment again, so that people can see what are the code changes being discussed. How do you feel about that? Do you have anything that you want to add? Any comments that you want to provide, etc.? And then that process closes. The technical committee meets again, discusses all those comments and inputs again. And then the final step in the process, if there are still any issues at that point that haven't been figured out yet, there's still something that people are debating or anything like that, then the next step in the process is to go to our open public meeting that happens as part of our annual conference every year, where we have our annual technical meeting. And that typically draws several hundred NFPA members to the meeting who are going to vote on any remaining changes. And so at that meeting, which is an open public format, people who are on the for side of whatever issue can get up and talk, and then anybody who's on the against side can get up and talk. Everybody has a couple minutes to speak whatever they want to say. And then once all open public comments are heard at that meeting and there's nobody left at the microphones, then the Standards Council will discuss what will the language be in the final edition of the code based on the people who are for or against. And they'll show the language up on the screen. The NFPA members who are attending the meeting will vote one way or the other, basically a yes or no vote, depending on what the change is. And then whatever receives the majority vote at that meeting is the final version of what will go into the next edition of the code. There is an appeals process after that can be appealed to our Standards Council. But sort of like what Karl talked about, they really don't have much say in terms of what the code actually says. They're there to make sure that the process was followed properly and all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed and all that kind of stuff. And as long as the process was followed properly through the public consensus process, whatever was voted on at the meeting is the final say. That then gets published in the next edition of the code or standard. And then essentially the process starts all over again right after that. I'll give a quick rundown of our categories also who make up our technical committees. We have representatives on our technical committees from manufacturers, end users, installers and maintainers, labor representatives, applied research, enforcing authorities, insurance reps, consumers, and special experts. And we also have one other category that's special to some of our electrical codes. Those are the types of people that we look for to make up our technical committees. And the whole process is balanced in such a manner that no one of those categories can dominate the process. Everybody has an equal say, equal vote. Everybody has equal representation at the table, so to speak, to be able to participate in the process. And then it takes a majority vote at the different points that I described through the process to make a code proposal move forward into the next phase of the process. Again, with over 300 codes and standards, we're on various cycles for the different ones. It would be impossible to try and do all of them at once. So they follow different cycles over a 3-year continuing process. And as the next edition gets published, it then starts the process over again as it continues. All this information is available on our website. Anybody can participate. It's free. The only thing that's needed is the ability to log into our site with a username and a password. That's all that's needed. And then you're able to get into the codes and standards and make changes. And us as the regional representatives and other people who work at NFPA, we provide training on that process for various entities around the country, so that if your organization wants to learn more, I know that was a lot to throw at you all at once, but if your organization wants to learn more and go a little more in depth on how does the process work and things like that, we're always happy to show you how to do that.
Great. Thank you both very much for that background. I think if we can narrow it down now a little bit, and we'll see if we can play a lightning round. We'll test it out. For both Karl and Bob, what do the current codes and standards say about single stairway or one-way out residential buildings? And kind of what are their limits as is today?
Yeah, John, I'll take it. So really what we're talking about here in technical terms is what we call residential group R2. And an R2 is a type of an occupancy, right? So that is what is the area that's under discussion in our codes and that we'd want our audience to know about. So R2 occupancies are covered in the commercial code, which for us is the International Building Code. And those types of occupancies, again, group R2 contain sleeping units or more than 2 dwelling units where the occupants are primarily permanent in nature. And those include a variety of different types of dwellings. So first and foremost, we're talking about apartment houses or congregate living facilities with more than 16 occupants, dormitories, even for the fire service, their emergency services, living quarters, or even things that kind of touch us as normal day-to-day people in the community, vacation timeshare properties. And we know that short-term rentals in many cases are covered under that as well, depending on how they're built, right? So right now, the current codes speak to one way out in the ICC world for group R2 as including a basement, first, second, or third story over grade plane, like where the ground is, right? Or an occupiable roof over the first or second story. So the short story really is a total of 3 stories or less qualify for a single stairway or one way out at this point. Although, and I won't take much from this because my colleague, Chief Marshall, and I'm sure Chief DeCrane will speak to this as well too. There is a proposal in the ICC model code development process for the 2027 codes that proposes taking that from a total of 3 stories up to 4 stories, and we can cover that in a little bit more detail farther in the webinar. But I'll leave it there and send it over to Bob because what you'll see here is that while the ICC process speaks to 3 stories, it's a little bit different over at the National Fire Protection Association, and I'll leave that to him to speak to.
Thanks, Karl. Yep. So at NFPA, this particular issue is addressed in NFPA, what we call NFPA 101 or Standard 101, which is our life safety code. And for apartment type buildings, R2s, like Karl was talking about, it allows up to 4 stories high with a single stairway, with a couple conditions attached to that are detailed in the standard. So among other things, with that, you can't have more than 4 dwelling units per floor. The building must be fully sprinklered in accordance with requirements either for a commercial type sprinkler system or a residential type sprinkler system. And we're always happy to discuss the specific details about what exactly that means. But basically, the building is fully sprinklered in all the living spaces. The exit stairway is protected by a 1-hour fire barrier all around. The travel distance from any of those units to the full exit distance can't exceed 35 feet to the stairway. And there's a half-hour fire barrier required between the apartment, the dwelling units themselves on each floor. So in other words, with the condition of a single way out, there are these other protective measures in place to help better ensure safety for everybody to be able to get out quickly if there's a fire.
We discussed the background of the codes and standards process and how much work really goes into it. So what would your opinion be on the importance for policymakers to trust that process and use the established code rather than legislating around it?
Yeah, I think we could speak about that for hours if you gave that one to Bob and I and to the other guests on the webinar today. I think the way to summarize that is that here in the U.S., the code development process is already captured and established rulemaking processes throughout the country at the state level. Essentially, federal legislation there and getting into code starts to short circuit an established process. And really the way to kind of summarize this at the high level is to say that federal legislation is really just a short-term answer to a question that maybe hasn't been asked, which is typically for a single issue or for a single interest, that short-term answer really fails to follow those 4 basic tenets that I outlined in the introduction here, which was what our code development process follows, which is openness, balance of interest, transparency, and an appeals process that is a process all the way through designed for the codes. Legislating wasn't designed for that. Certainly have respect for the process, but it's something that if there was a takeaway for a staffer or a member hearing this message today, it's understand that there's a process and that the federal piece certainly overlays and potentially short circuits or displaces many of the strong rulemaking processes that are already in place here in the U.S. In most of each of the states here in the country today.
So I think it's important to remember, again, the codes and standards are developed by technical committees that are made up of experts in their fields. And so you have that blend of people who are represented from, again, engineering, fire, building code backgrounds, inspectors, insurance folks, authorities having jurisdiction, manufacturers, all the people who are actually involved in all the different components and processes that go into building design, building construction, and ultimately building maintenance, over the lifetime of the building, are coming from these expert backgrounds where this is what they do. This is their career. And so through the codes and standards process and having these committees, everybody has input from their perspective. And so the final product that comes out is a blend of everybody's thoughts and ideas and what everybody could come to consensus agreement on from all those different walks of life. And I think in the legislative process, you don't always have that. You may have a couple of experts in specific roles who provide input at some of the legislative hearings and things like that. But are you really truly getting input from all the different important perspectives that go into design and construction and maintenance of a building, including, as you're going to hear the chiefs talk about, the firefighting part of it, which includes, can the people get out safely? Can the firefighters get in to deal with the emergency? And are they working? Can both those things happen at the same time? And I'm sure they're going to discuss that quite a bit, where you can run into the problem of people trying to come down an exit stair at the same time that firefighters are trying to go up an exit stair and things like that. So I don't want to steal any of their thunder, but again, it's just the standards process that's in place brings together all those different areas of expertise, and that's the strength of the consensus process.
Yeah, John, if I could just add to that, Sean DeCrane with the International Association of Firefighters. And one of the parts of, I think the important parts of the standard and code development process is what Bob just hit on. It's having multi-professionals and multi-disciplines within that discussion. Our buildings today are designed as systems. So all of those systems fit together to provide safety for the occupants and for the responding firefighters. And when you go through a legislative process, again, I'm with Bob and Karl, not disrespecting that process. Are you getting the input of the fire protection system, the fire alarm system, the egress experts? All of those systems that are being designed into that building are being affected by those decisions. And are you having that input from all of those disciplines so you come walking away with the best design that you can craft from that discussion? So I think it's critically important we don't lose that perspective from the standards and codes process development.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. So with that, that's a good segue. We will shift over to the fire reality, what things are like on the ground. So for either one of you, from an operational standpoint, what are the main challenges firefighters would face in single stairway buildings? And how does the single means of egress kind of affect evacuation, search and rescue, firefighter safety generally? If either of you could talk about that.
Sure, I'll go first and then I'll turn it over to Robert. Space. I mean, when you start putting on gear on a firefighter, they take up more space than a normal human being standing in that stairwell. And a lot of us probably remember the pictures after 9/11 of FDNY trying to come up the steps while the occupants were trying to effect egress. And it just becomes really cramped. And so both are impeding the progress of each other. And we're also talking about instances, if you have a fire where people are under pressure, people are scared, people are panicking, and they're trying to get themselves out of that building. But in order for us to take away the problem that's driving them out of the building, we need to gain access to it. So as we start to not only put on our gear and our SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus, but start carrying our hose lines, start carrying our Halligan or axes to gain access, we're taking up more space and we're restricting the flow of the occupants, which then refocuses the firefighters' efforts for those occupants and not necessarily taking the hazard away. And so that extends the time frame as well. So those are some of the immediate considerations that we have. And I know Robert wants to build on that.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Robert Marshall with the International Association of Fire Chiefs. And one of the things that I did in California was I actually co-chaired the single stair task group. We were tasked by the state legislature to come up with recommendations for them on whether or not they should legislate something. And that report just came out. If you go to the California State Fire Marshal's website, you can absolutely go and look that up. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on was actually risk modeling, where we use models to determine what would happen in the evacuation scenarios. And then along with that, we actually conducted some live exercises using a fire department and occupants out of the building. And what it showed in both cases is exactly what Sean was just talking about, that the egress is inhibited when you have a single stair and you have firefighters trying to go up and occupants trying to come down. And in the cases where we did these particular studies, we found that it actually doubles the amount of time to come out. One of the things that was particularly interesting is we watched videos of people actually trying to navigate the stairways. And keep in mind, these were situations where there was not an active fire. These were drills. Right. So one of the things that we found was when the firefighters extended the hoses, those created essentially barriers for people because they couldn't climb over them. If you have somebody who's younger, they can certainly do that. But if you were dealing in a building where there were elderly occupants, for example, they aren't going to be able to climb over or go under the hose lines as we're advancing them in those stairwells. And then keep in mind, again, because this was a drill situation, we didn't have smoke. And people coming down from above are going to encounter smoke as soon as the firefighters start these operations because they open the door and the hose lines actually block that door open. So heat and smoke is going to get into the stairwell. So absolutely, there are a lot of things that go into this. I think the other point that I wanted to make is that depending on where you are in the US, your response models are going to be different. You may have a volunteer fire department that doesn't have a lot of people. You may have somebody like FDNY or San Francisco Fire who have tremendous amounts of human resources to be able to throw at a problem. And the problem with legislation, particularly on the national level, is it ignores all of the individual differences among local jurisdictions. And that creates a big problem as well. So I think, when you look at it, it's better if we can keep this kind of thing at a local level so that people can do what's best for their individual communities instead of a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that. You brought up the California modeling exercise. Do either of you have any other examples of new building proposals or incidents involving the one-way out structures and kind of maybe where we're heading towards?
Yeah, I can kick that one off. So in 2002, I actually had an incident in which a mother and her two kids actually died because they only had access to a single stairway. It was a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 35-year-old woman who was the mother of the two children. Her 70-year-old mother was also with them, but when she encountered the heat in the stairwell when she was trying to evacuate, she determined that she wasn't going to be able to make it because she couldn't move fast enough, so she retreated back into her apartment, and she was the only one that survived. So I've actually had firsthand experience with what happens in a single stair, and that was only a 3-story building. So, when you start to increase the height, that certainly can create some problems. I think that's another one of the points that I wanted to make sure we touched on was that it's easy to make a rule that says, hey, you're going to do this. But if we do that and it doesn't work and it results in more fatalities, it's really hard to rebuild that building. In fact, it'd be pretty much impossible to rebuild the building if we start down that path. And so, if we are going to go down this path of increasing the size of buildings, doing it in an incremental manner, seeing what the consequences are, and then evaluating whether or not it's worth it to go to the next level is probably a better approach. So As far as the codes, and Karl alluded to this earlier, the ICC is looking at increasing the limit. Right now, there is a proposal to increase it to 4 stories, very similar to what NFPA 101 does, that Bob was mentioning. We have very similar provisions in ICC that right now look like they're going to pass. It has passed all of the preliminary stuff and still needs to go on to the final vote. But that's kind of where we are. I think the only big difference between what ICC is doing and what NFPA already does is the International Building Code has some exemptions in it that you're allowed to do in stairs and buildings with multiple stairs. We took those exceptions out because this is going to be the only way out of the building. And then the other thing that we did was we disallowed any sort of electrical connections that somebody could plug in in those stairwells. And that was basically an acknowledgement of the lithium-ion battery problem, particularly that FDNY and Philadelphia have seen with micromobility devices such as e-bikes and e-scooters being charged in places and they catch fire. They actually have a fairly high incidence of catching fire. And so we wanted to make sure that nobody could charge their devices like those kinds of e-bikes and so on in a stairwell when that was the only way out of the building.
Yeah, and just to build on Robert, I've been trying to do some research and identify the losses in a single stairway versus a building with 2 stairways has been a challenge just within how we report our fire incident reports here in the US. But, I just want to point out to Robert's comment earlier about taking a wide brush, like the state of Missouri is proposing legislation that would ban local jurisdictions from restricting a single stair in their community, even though they may have very few resources to respond to an incident. And so we're trying to find a wide brush solution to an housing affordability, without really taking a step back and analyzing what's the impact of that. And the impact could take years. The impact could take time because these buildings have to be built, have to be lived in, have to incur an incident, and then you incur those losses. Well, it's kind of too late to go back and modify those buildings. They're there. You're stuck with that design and you're stuck with that implementation. And when I looked at a recent NFPA report looking at fire loss in the US, when we start to compare 1 and 2 family homes versus apartments, we're actually seeing an increase in fatalities per incident in 1 and 2 family homes. But when you look at the comparison of apartment building loss of life compared to 1980, we see a reduction of 37% of fatalities. So has there been a study looking at what are the contributing factors to that loss in life? Is it the installation and maintenance of the smoke alarm, smoke detector system? Is it the introduction of sprinklers, the maintenance of sprinklers? Is it the introduction of separations? So what is the impact? What are we improving on? Before we just start saying, well, we don't have a lot of losses. I mean, I could make the argument that the high-rise fire loss in Hong Kong recently was a single stair because the second stairwell was closed for repairs. I can make the argument that that loss in Switzerland in the nightclub was a single stair issue because there was only one way out of that building. We have other instances that we can, a nightclub in Chicago, someone set off pepper spray and several dozen people died in that response of people trying to get to one stairwell. So I don't think we've had a legitimate discussion looking at the contributing factors to see how we're reducing those losses in apartment buildings and what is the impact of this. Because we can look at some modeling on egress, but as Mike Tyson would say, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And when that smoke starts to fill in that stairwell, that is a punch in the face to folks. And how are people going to respond? They're not going to respond as a computer model says it will. That's not disrespecting. Modeling has its role. But again, I think we have to base these changes on further study.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think both of you touched on it a little bit in your last answers, but what message would you want to make directly to policymakers about what's at stake on the ground for the fire service?
There's never a silver bullet to an answer to any question. It's not like, oh, we have an affordable housing issue. Oh, let's just remove this dual stairwells, and that's our answer. The city of Vancouver did a study. They put out a challenge to architects to design a structure on one piece of land that was deemed that it's impossible with a 2-stairwell building on that land, but somehow they did. And when you compared the structures, I believe one design increased the floor space by 8%. A second design increased the floor space by 4%. And a third design increased that floor space by 2%. So is the increased risk worth that gain? And I think that's a legitimate discussion. So I would ask the legislatures to take a step back. There is no silver bullet. I don't think we want to enact something that's going to have consequences to their population, their constituents, going down the road without those discussions.
Yeah, and I would add to what Sean said in that a lot of the ways that the supporters of single stair frame this particular issue is that this is the one issue that is the problem. But I haven't seen a lot of studies or a lot of talk about some of the other things that are very important, that are not life safety issues, but they're very expensive. For example, energy. When you start to put energy systems, energy saving systems into these buildings, they become very, very expensive very quickly. Low E glass, for example, which is insulated glass that you put on buildings, they're very expensive. All of that technology surrounding that can be a lot of cost. And so rather than jump to looking at a wholesale approach to everything and deciding what is important and what isn't important when it comes to affordability really is something that needs to be taken a look at. I think the other thing is when you start looking at safety systems in these kinds of buildings, nationally and even internationally, these are the buildings where fires happen most often. You're talking about rental properties, you're talking about places where the average income is lower. So now we're shifting the safety burden to people who have a higher incidence of fire, have a higher incidence of injury, and have a higher incidence of death. And you're talking about removing one of the remaining safety components that can help them in those situations. So I think those are also important points. It's not just the stairs that are an affordability issue, it's everything in the building space. So let's look at it as a wholesale thing rather than just one particular issue that somebody doesn't like.
Yeah. John, maybe this is out of place where to talk about, but we're talking with our legislatures that you have to truly understand what you're analyzing. The British Columbia commissioned a report, an analysis to look at this issue, and that report was put forth. And when they went through it, they did a risk analysis, right? And during that risk analysis, which they put towards in the report, identified some of the concerns, and they rated these concerns. I'm going to reference it to risk score of 10 to 20, which is unacceptable, poses immediate threat. 6 to 9, which is acceptable short term, may pose a threat to personal safety. And to these issues of what they're relying on, because remember, these buildings are going in, and these buildings have to be maintained. But when you start to analyze the integrity of egress facilities and maintenance, probability of failure is probable. It's given a 16. Potential severity, catastrophic, due to potential for multiple failures to the means of egress. When we talk about maintenance on fire alarm systems, a grade of 9. Occasional, possibility of poor maintenance. Again, it's critical, potential to the occupants. And the inspections and maintenance. Again, it's given a 12, so probable, likelihood to occur over the life of the building based on various studies and fire investigations. And the impact is critical. So I think we have to look, as Robert was saying, and I think Bob and Karl would say, we have to look at this issue holistically, and it's not just the initial design and building of that building. The real question is, are you going to invest in the maintenance of that building and to understand or to make sure that that jurisdiction has the capabilities of inspecting and imposing behavioral changes to make sure that the owners of that building upkeep the fire protection systems that were designed into it.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for sharing your experience. If we can open it up to everybody, I'd like to hear, hopefully from each of you, your thoughts on how housing advocates, designers, and the fire service can work together proactively to kind of modernize the codes and standards responsibly and maybe listen and hear from one another. How would you see that working?
Yeah, I can jump on that one first for you, John, and say we already have a process for that. Our process, the NFPA process, all of our other standards development organizations, those discussions are happening. And what you're seeing happen in the 2027 code development cycle that all of the folks on this call as fellow panelists have been involved with intimately. The discussions that happen on the hearing floor are important. The ones that happen in the back of the room and when we are actually not at our hearings are the places where those discussions are already happening today, and they're very thoughtful. They can become heated at times, but we have a process for that. And I'm really proud to be able to speak on behalf of code development writ large and say our standards development organizations writ large do that each and every day. And it's a matter of really trusting the process, not becoming frustrated in the process, but making sure that all voices are heard. So that's where I'll step in strongly on that and leave some other time for my other colleagues. But that's a big piece. It already exists, and those conversations are happening, and we're going to see some outcomes here in the next couple of months once we get through over our public comment hearings of a process that worked.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Karl just said. Same thing on the NFPA side. The process is already in place. The question that you asked is already there. The important part is to get involved. And so to the folks who are asking the question, how do we bring these different entities together to discuss these issues? The process is already there waiting for you to take part. So please get involved. And again, we provide training on how to do that. I understand that they can seem complicated when you haven't been involved before. How do I get involved? Who do I talk to? Where do I start? And things like that. And that's why our various entities have representatives out in the field to provide training on those things. So, for example, for NFPA, that's one of the things I do in my region. I train, we talk to the various entities that we call our stakeholder groups. We speak with our stakeholder groups all the time, explaining, hey, did you know that this standard is open for public comment? How do you feel about it? Do you want to submit a public comment? Sure, I'd love to, but I don't know how to do that. Well, here, let me show you how to do that. Well, when's the meeting coming up? Well, let me tell you when the meeting is. I'll even tell you how to attend in person if you'd like to, or you can attend virtually. It simply takes putting aside a little bit of time and actually getting involved in the process. And sort of as Karl mentioned, there's a lot of conversations going on. There's the main conversation going on that the committee itself is discussing any particular issue at a given time. But there's also various side discussions going on with the different groups that are represented. And so there's your example right there of, you mentioned 3 or 4 different groups. How do they get together and discuss these things? Be part of the main technical meeting. And then you can also meet on the side while you're there to discuss, if you, amongst the 4 of you, your 4 groups, for example, have a consensus idea of, hey, we should, talk about proposing a such and such change in the code or standard. What do you all think? And then you all get together to do that. Then you can come forward and put forth that proposal. And again, there's a process set up to do that so that everybody has a fair say and it's all done in a proper, fair manner and all that kind of stuff. But we're always happy to show folks how to get involved in that process. It's already there.
I will say both NFP, Bob and Karl, their staffs are more than willing to assist folks who want to participate in their programs and their processes. And we encourage our firefighters to reach out to us at the IFF if you have questions, or certainly to the NFPA staff or ICC staff, because they've been more than welcoming. But, one of my messages would be to the participants is that you need to be able to come to a process and be able to have an adult conversation. And just because you're told no, or someone doesn't buy what you're selling right away, don't go up to the microphone and say you were disrespected because someone voted against you, which I witnessed. And so maybe you need to bring back better data. Maybe you need to bring back better information and really demonstrate what your message is. Because the groups that are involved in these processes tend to be a little, I don't want to say skeptical, but they look at the information, they look at the data, and they evaluate the data compared to what the ask is. And you could throw a bunch of numbers or what you feel is making your case, but if the audience isn't buying it, then you need to remessage or need to bring better data. One of the things I learned in this process early on is that it gave me the ability to tap into a lot of experts around me. And I spent a lot of time learning from architects, from engineers, from building designers, other trades. Just as I said earlier, how this building is a system and how it starts to fit in the pieces. But so yeah, that would be my message to the participants as well. Come in with your eyes open, your ears open, and be willing to have a discussion.
And then I would just finish this off by saying that so I'm the chair of the Fire Code Action Committee for ICC, and Sean is actually on the Fire Code Action Committee as well. And we've had a lot of meetings on this particular topic. Every time we have a meeting on this topic, it is 150 people or more from across the industries. And, one of the things like Sean mentioned is that sometimes the proponents of single stair come into it and they don't like what they're hearing. And so they say, well, we'll just get it legislated instead. We'll just bypass this process because we don't like the way the consensus process works. I can tell you that from our perspective as well, I think, and Sean's probably a really good example of this, when we negotiated how to do this increase to 4 stories, people in fire service were not happy. But this was a compromise. And that's the story here, is that we have to try and compromise this. I know that next time I see Sean, he's probably going to punch me, or he'll probably make me pay for my own beer next time I see him because of this. But that's the way the process works. And if I were to give one message, the message is trust the process. The process works itself out so that we have what's best for everybody at a given time. And then if it works, then we can renegotiate, we can revisit the issue, we can talk about it. I get that that's not, something that a lot of people like to do in this instant gratification world that we all live in. But when you're talking about somebody's safety, not having a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 35-year-old woman die because they only had access to a single stair, that's what we need to do.
Yeah, thank you all. Those are all great points. The last question I had to pick everyone's brain with, I guess my question would be, how do we reconcile the urgent need for affordable housing while also taking care of the residents in these buildings and the firefighters that show up when they're needed? Do you guys have opinions on how you kind of balance that?
From my perspective, I think it really goes to that whole thing about people going in and opening their minds to hearing differing points of view, right? You get into these code hearings, you get into these discussions, you get into webinars, and you talk about all of the issues and figure out, well, where can we make the most impact? Like I mentioned, I'm from California. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. We probably have one of the bigger problems when it comes to the housing crisis, particularly when it comes to affordability. I live in the East Bay. Oakland is right over the hill from me. San Francisco is 20 minutes from me, getting into downtown. So I see this every day. And I certainly believe that we can can do better when it comes to this. But legislating a one-size-fits-all approach is really not the way to kind of go about it. So, having the discussions, having an open mind, considering all of the different points of view, and then taking that action on what is best for your community is the better way to go rather than take that broad brush.
I guess what I'd add to that too is on the affordable housing argument, when we start to talk about single stair, many of the buildings that are trying to be designed by folks across the industry, whether that be architectural professionals, engineers, construction professionals, or others that are in the building community, would say that oftentimes we are designing these for folks that need the buildings the most. They may not have, from an affordability standpoint, the money to be able to invest. Oftentimes, they're either less insured or even non-insured folks. They may be people that are living on fixed incomes or rely on supplementary income from the government, whether that be state or federal government or both. And I guess the question that I have on this as essentially a facilitator, a staff member of a group that facilitates this process is why are we in a mode of potentially compromising safety in scenarios for people who need it the most? Just because you have an affordability issue that you're addressing as an individual, and we're trying to build more homes and more buildings for those who need it the most. We need to make sure that we're not missing the point here that safety is not just for those who can afford it, it's for everyone.
I think Karl and Robert have hit it right on the head. I mean, I would like to see us have a holistic discussion on what are the obstacles to affordable housing. What are the contributing factors to the cost? Is it the cost of the property? Is it the cost of construction? Is it the cost of licensing? And what individual influences in those costs are most impacting the affordability of building this housing that's needed. I don't think, at least I haven't seen that yet, right? Before we start removing safety features. I served my career in a city it's not a wealthy city. So I spent my career responding to that community. And people aren't realizing that at the end of the day, the firefighters are impacted. Not only is there safety compromise because how they have to operate in a single stair or trying to remove occupants while trying to fight the fire in a confined area at the same time, but we also have to deal with the human impact of that. It's a firefighter that's going to go in there and remove these occupants, dead or alive. And we're the ones that interact with the public on a daily basis. We get to know the people in our response neighborhoods. And so, there is a personal cost or an impact on this. And I think, some people have come to us in the fire service and said, oh, you're just standing fast, you're trying to be a roadblock. No, we take an oath to protect our communities. And that protection is in an active response, but it's also by being proactive to speak on our constituents' behalf when we see a safety issue. So we do have the safety of our citizens, in the forethought of our minds right now as we start to discuss this issue. So I don't want that to be lost in this discussion at all.
Yeah, and I'll add in sort of like a historical component here, if you will. A lot of times when you see a requirement in a code or standard, it's because something happened in the past, and that's where that requirement came from. And yeah, sometimes you might have to dig back several decades to see what was the thing that caused that code change. You can look back to the several decades ago. For example, we had several multi-death fires over the space of 10 or 20 years, and that's where a lot of code changes came from. Revolving doors, sprinklers, heights of buildings, stairways, all the things that we're talking about and many more. And, there's a cost to anything, but it's like, well, how much are you going to take back out of the code and put those same lives at risk again from the lessons that we've already learned? We're not trying to be a roadblock. We're trying to make sure the same thing doesn't happen again. We talk about safety doesn't happen by chance. What's that mean? Well, it's because we've had things happen in the past where we know that the different conditions can cause a problem where people might not be able to get out of the building. It could put firefighters at risk, things like that. And oftentimes when one of those incidents happens, it's like, well, what can we do to prevent this from happening again? I'm sure you've heard that in news reports and things like that after a disaster happens. How do we keep this from happening again? And oftentimes that's going to be something that gets addressed in the codes and standards. And then you might have to, again, dig back several decades to find out what was that thing, but we don't want to just suddenly start taking stuff back out of the codes and standards because we forgot that very valuable lesson learned. I mean, you've heard all of the other panelists today talk about different incidents they've either been involved with personally or seen happen. That's where these codes and standards come from in the first place. So we don't want to reduce anything. We're always mindful of the cost. And it's always talking about, well, what cost do you put on a human life? You know, where's the balance there? And that's what we try to address in the codes and standards.
Yeah, that's great. I think what I'm hearing from everyone is affordable housing is important, and no one's saying that we shouldn't have affordable housing, but we need to get there safely, and we need to remember that aspect of it too. And with our codes and standards, like Bob said, these came from incidents that have already happened. So we don't want to just brush it past as if we just made it up. And I think the fact that anyone can propose codes and standards is really important, and it makes it accessible to anyone. And like I said, I think the affordability and safety are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We just need to figure out a way to have affordable housing, but maintaining that safety component that everyone's worked so hard to build. With that, is there any last messages that anyone wants to get out before we wrap up here?
Well, as we talked about, can't stress enough, the process is already in place for everything that we're talking about. So when people talk about, you know, how do you change this? How do we make something go away? How do we change something? How do we make something new? Whatever. Please get involved in the process. It's already there. Feel free to reach out to us anytime. We're happy to help you out with that.